This is part 9 of the Craftsman 6-inch joiner rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 8, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we'll be polishing the columns and fixing the hand wheel. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. In order to clean up and polish the columns, we're going to have to construct a poor man's lathe. Now, I've gone over this in other videos, but I'm going to go over it again so that everybody understands. Basically, I've got a board here with 4 casters on it. I've got 2 wooden legs that I can get at Home Depot for furniture. I've got a long threaded rod, some nuts for that threaded rod, and some washers. I've got a drill, and then I've got some 2x4s screwed together that act as a base for the drill. So I'm going to screw down this board that has the casters on it. These are 2-inch casters that I get at Lowe's. They're real cheap. They're like, I don't know, $4 or $5 a piece. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the threaded rod, and I've got some wooden legs. These are like in the wood section, but they're furniture legs that you can get, and they have a couple different designs. These are just some of the ones that I have. And I insert one in one end of the column, and then the threaded rod goes all the way through them. I drilled the centers out on those. And then put the other wooden leg on the other end. And then I put the washer on, and then I screw on 2 nuts, and I jam the second nut onto the first nut. So the thing about this is that the inside of the column is not completely true. It's a welded pipe, so there's a weld line down one side of it, and it's not machined on the inside in any way. So because of that, even though the casters may be lined up properly with the column, it's not going to be completely smooth when it starts spinning. There's going to be some sort of an offset, but the offset will be minimal, and you can readjust the threaded rod. It's got some play. I think the hole is probably 1/8 of an inch larger than the rod itself. So I'm just now installing the drill, and any drill will do, but a corded drill is best, I think. So you don't have to worry about running down a battery. And then we're just going to chuck that threaded rod into the chuck. I did turn down about a 2-inch section of the end of the threaded rod so it would smoothly chuck in the chuck. And you can kind of see already how this is going to work. I use this same process except with a longer threaded rod for my drill press columns when I clean them up. But this initial setup is a little bit of trial and error until you get everything kind of lined up the way it needs to be. And then you'll see here in a second that once I've got it roughly lined up, without strapping down the drill, I'm going to turn it on for a second and let that column spin and see how bad the wobble is on it. You can see how as I turn the column by hand, it is moving the drill, and that'll help align that drill a little better. So then I've got some more screws and some webbing that I'm going to use to strap down the drill once we get everything lined up as good as we can get it. So I'm going to screw down those 2x4s that the drill is resting in. And that's just a piece of 1/2-inch floor foam that's resting under the drill that'll help cushion some of the vibration. And we'll plug it in and give it a go and see what happens. So right now the nuts on the far end weren't tightened down enough. And you can see how much wobble there is in the drill right there. So, but I think we can work with that. So we're going to go ahead and strap the drill down. So what I didn't realize at this time was one of the casters is pretty blown out. The inside portion of the caster that rides on its shaft is plastic. There's no bearing in there, and it's just completely wobbled out at this point from me using it so much. So I end up having to replace that caster, and I go ahead and replace all of them a little bit later, but here's where I'm seeing that issue. All right, so new casters, and we're ready to start. So at this point, this column is so pitted and so rusted, even though we derusted it. I'm going to use a flap wheel on my angle grinder, and I've got 3 different flap wheels here. I'm starting with a 40 grit flap wheel, and I'm just going to go down the length of the column. Obviously, you can see the slower you go, the better results you're going to get. And after we finish with this 40 grit, we're going to go with a 60 grit and then an 80 grit flap wheels. But these will take off paint and everything else that's on that column. Now the pitting is kind of deep into the column, so we're going to get good finish on this column when it's all said and done, but it's not going to be perfect. So at that point, we're ready to switch over to the next flap wheel, and this is the 60 grit. We do basically the same thing. And what I wasn't paying attention to is I didn't strap the drill down very well, and the column has creeped to the left here. So it's actually that wooden leg that's running on those casters. So I had to restrap the drill down. But once we had it restrapped, we can go ahead and hit it with the 80 grit. And that will give it a pretty clean finish. But next we're going to go ahead and dry sand this column. So since we ended with an 80 grit flap wheel, we're going to start with an 80 grit piece of sandpaper on my orbital sander. And we're going to go up from 80. We're going to go 80, 100, 120, I think 180, 220, and then 320. And we're going to go all the way down the column, and then we're going to come all the way back up the column with each one of these grits. So I'll speed up the footage here in a minute, but I wanted to show that we go all the way down and then we come all the way back up. And try not to stop or anything like that along the way. The smoother you do this, the smoother the results are going to be. And you're going to need at least 2 steps between each 100 of a grit. So you got 80 and 100, 120 and 180. And then when you get to 200s, you can go 220 and then 320. But you're going to go through all of those grits. The more grit stages you go through, the better your results are going to be. And you're not pressing down real hard or anything here. The goal is to remove the lines and swirls from the previous grit, just like we did on the stator band. So this is your 320 grit, and we're done now. So the next stage is going to be wet sanding. And right now, if you just want a satin finish to your column, this would be fine. But I want it to have kind of a chrome finish, so I'm wet sanding. Now, with wet sanding, we're going to, just like we did on the stator band, I'm going to start at 320, and I'm going to go 320, 400, 600, 800, and then 1,000. And I'm going to stop at 1,000. And we're going to go all the way down, wetting the sandpaper about every 10 inches. And then we're going to come all the way back up, wetting the sandpaper about every 10 inches. And then we'll wipe down the column and re-wet it, and then move on to the next grit, doing the exact same thing every single time. But you've got to remember to rinse the column and wipe it down between each grit. Otherwise, you're just sanding for no reason. So again, I'll speed up the footage here in a second. I think I went ahead and did this whole round of the 320 and the wipe down at regular speed, and then I sped it up after that. But the big key here is to keep that sandpaper wet and wipe between each grit. So when you're wiping it down, be careful that the rag doesn't get caught between the column and the casters, otherwise it'll get jerked out of your hand. I've had that happen a couple times, but no big deal. This isn't moving super fast, so it's not very dangerous. But I do this method as opposed to building or using a lathe or something like that, so that everybody that has a drill can do this. I mean, this is not complicated. That's why it's called a poor man's lathe. So 600, 800, and then 1,000. And you can see that that finish on that column is looking really good at this point. All right, and we'll give it one last rinse and wipe down. And then we're going to dry the column off. Then we'll move all this wet stuff out of the way. You can see by my arms, this gets very messy. All right, so now we're ready to apply the Mother's mag and aluminum polish. And like I said before, this stuff just works miracles. It's like magic. We're just going to apply this all over the column. Then once we've got it on there, we will go ahead and buff it off. And I'm using ShamWows. I just prefer them. I like them. So I buy a big pack of these things off of Amazon. And we're just going to buff all the way down and then flip that ShamWow over and then buff all the way back. And that's how I polish columns. And see if you get a close up here. So you can still see the lines from the flap wheels, but you know, it still looks great. So this is the second column, and I'm just going to speed through all this because it's exactly the same thing. And just talk about it. You know, it's a real simple process just as long as you follow the steps. Now, I probably could have used a Scotch-Brite pad on my angle grinder after the flap wheels, and that probably would have given us a little bit better of a finish. But I didn't do that, so this is what we got. So the flap wheels and the dry sanding are all pretty simple, just going through the various stages. The wet sanding is where it gets a little bit more in depth, and even that is fairly simple. Just remember to rinse between each grit, and make sure you use enough grits that you are effectively sanding the previous lines. And then after that, you can go ahead and polish that column. And boom, you're done. So this process took me about 18 minutes to explain to you, but in actuality, it probably took me about 2 hours to do. So it's not a super long thing, it's just kind of a messy thing, and there is a bit of a setup. So after we've wiped down those columns, we're going to go ahead and put a coat of wax on them, and for that I use Johnson's paste wax, but Johnson doesn't sell or make their paste wax anymore, which is their flagship product, so it makes no sense to me why they stopped, but okay. It really, any floor wax, paste wax would do. And the purpose of the wax is just to put a layer of protection on that column because it's raw metal now and it'll rust if any water or anything like that gets on there. So next thing we're going to do is I've decided I'm going to remove that handle off of the hand wheel. So I'm drilling out the end of it where it's kind of mushroomed out and it's got a washer sitting under it. I did this on my 10-inch table saw as well, so I know I can do it. So after we've drilled that out, we can go ahead and remove the hand wheel and that washer. And there's the handle sitting between those two 2x4s. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to drill and then tap the handle. So I made this wooden jig up to hold it perpendicular to the table. Just drilling it out with the proper drill bit. I'm going to thread in an 8/32 screw, so I'll be tapping it for that. Next, I've got some wooden blocks to kind of jig it inside my vise, and we're running the tap now. And these blocks are not hardwood, so they end up splitting on me. But no big deal. Once I've got that tap started, I can start working it a little bit. I think what happened is the handle started to spin a little bit, so I tightened down the vise. I don't really remember now, but that's what crushed those wooden blocks, and there they go. So I had to replace those with some oak. The problem with the oak is it's not grabby enough, so the handle just kind of just spun inside there, no matter how much I tightened them down. But I've got that in there deep enough for a 3/8 long screw to go into it, so that's really all we needed. So at this point we can go ahead and pull the tap out. And then we'll go ahead and test thread that screw in there. Now I did this because you can see how bad the chrome is on the handle and on the hand wheel. So I wanted to be able to polish them up. And the handle came out fabulous when I polished it. The hand wheel came out okay. But no problem. Screw goes in there just fine. It's going to do what we need it to do. So we're over at my metal lathe, and I'm going to go ahead and put the handle inside the lathe. And then we're going to dry sand it and then wet sand it and then polish it, just like we've done with everything else that we've used the same process for. So here I'm starting with 80 grit, and I'll go 80, 120, 180. I think it's 180. So 80, 120, 180, 220, 320, and then wet sanding 320 and 400, 600, and 800, and then 1,000. And again, just remember, between each wet sand, you need to rinse and wipe the item you're wet sanding. And then we'll apply some Mother's Mag and aluminum polish. Then we're going to buff that off with a ShamWow. And that will complete the work on the handle. So we'll do the hand wheel and a couple of other items in the next video, along with probably getting to some assembly of something. I'm not sure yet what, but that'll wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. As always, I appreciate the support, and I will see you next time.